Primer, Episode 2, Places, Peoples, and Cultures of Essos and the Other Continents, Part 7, The Three Quarrelsome Daughters. The next three cities that we're going to be looking at are traditionally grouped together and called the Quarrelsome Daughters. And that's why the cities of Tyrosh, Myr, and Lys are being covered in a single video as opposed to multiple videos or a single video for each city. And now some of you might be asking yourselves, why are these cities called daughters? Well, let's imagine that Valyria is their mother, and so these cities and any other cities that were founded by the freehold are all sort of Valyria's daughters. And they're called quarrelsome because they were constantly at war with each other over this area of really fertile land. And that's why this part of the map is labeled the Disputed Lands. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details of these wars between these cities. You can read all about it in the companion book, The World of Ice and Fire. I will just let you know that the majority of the people doing the actual fighting in these wars are sellsword companies like the Second Sons, the Stormcrows, the Windblown, and the Golden Company, to name a few. And just because there are so many wars going on, these sellsword companies become pretty rich and powerful over time. And not to get it twisted, these three cities don't just fight with each other. They were constantly under threat from places like Volantis. After the doom of Valyria, Volantis, the largest of the three cities, tried to become the new capital of the remnants of the Valyrian freehold that survived the doom. But they couldn't quite make it happen, so the cities that the Volantines attempted to control just ended up staying independent city-states. Now let's dive into some of the details of these three quarrelsome daughters and see what they were like individually. I'm just going to add that my real-life equivalents for these three cities might not be 100% one-for-one replicas, and I'm not super familiar with the history of the city-states of Renaissance Italy. So if you're watching and you've studied up on that topic, please be sure to leave me a comment below with any insights or corrections. In time, I'll add notations to this video to correct any mistakes I might make when I talk about places like Naples, Syracuse, and Capri. Okay, so in my estimation, the city of Tyrosh is Syracuse in Sicily, which is more or less part of Italy. Myr is the city-state of Naples, also in Italy, and Lys is kind of like the island of Capri, which, as you guessed it, is also in Italy. But if Capri was bigger and consisted of a series of islands grouped together as opposed to just a single teeny tiny island. In real life, I'm pretty sure these cities weren't constantly at war with each other, but they were all subject to constant invasions or conquests, just like the quarrelsome daughters from our story. And the city-states in Italy were pretty well known for using mercenary armies for their endless wars with each other, just like Tyrosh, Myr, and Lys. We're going to go through the three fictional cities one by one, and I'll show you why I think the real-life cities I just mentioned are the inspiration for the fictional ones. I know I just did that thing again where I sound like a pompous jerkwad know-it-all, but I promise you'll learn a little something about the real world in addition to learning about the Game of Thrones world, and that way we can all be insufferable know-it-alls together. Let's start our exploration with the city of Ty Roche. This island city is located on the most northeastern of the Stepstones. That's where the Arm of Dorne was crushed by the Hammer of the Waters. It's protected by gigantic stone walls and is basically a fortress. Originally, there wasn't another settlement here. Like, this spot was never held by the Andals or anyone else. So when the Valyrians showed up, they didn't have to conquer it or kill off any people living there to build their city. The original reason for Tyros's existence was as a Valyrian military checkpoint. It was also used to control shipping up and down the western coast of Essos. After all, look at this location. It's pretty dang strategic. Eventually, a city or town or what have you grew up around the fortress, and that eventually bloomed into the city-state of Tyrosh that we see today. Early on in the founding of the city, a species of snail was found that was unique to the Stepstones that secreted a slime that could be turned into hundreds of awesome dyes for fabric. depending on the diet of the snails and the production method of the dye. Pretty soon after that discovery, enterprising Valyrians showed up to the newly formed city and began building a whole industry around dyeing fabric in every color of the rainbow. This colorful industry became the backbone of Tyrosh's economy, and the people were so proud of that fact that they started dyeing their hair all types of crazy colors. So it's not unusual to see women with blue hair or men with green beards in this city. But just in case you were beginning to think of Tyrosh as a peaceful place full of cheerful, rainbow-colored people, let's bring you back down to reality. I mean, this is Game of Thrones after all. So these guys were really heavily into the slave trade, and they were particularly aggressive about it too. They even went as far as capturing and enslaving wildlings from beyond the wall to fight in their slave armies. And more than just slaves to defend their own borders, they trained all kinds of soldiers or pit fighter type gladiator dudes that were purchased by slavers all over the world for their excellence in fighting. In fact, Daenerys' boyfriend, or I guess ex-boyfriend now, Daario Naharis, was a Tyroshi pit fighter slave before he got free and became a sellsword. And I hope I don't offend anyone or draw too heavily on stereotypes, but Tyrosh also had this very Sicilian mafia vibe to the way things that were handled in the city. The slave trade and the trade in fabrics made people filthy stinking rich, and as you might imagine, the creation of a black market and organized crime was soon to follow. That's one of the reasons I chose the city of Syracuse in Sicily from ancient times to be a stand-in for Tyrosh. It was rich, powerful, and corrupt. The other reason is what I like to call the Archimedes Factor, because I am the coolest person on the planet. Just kidding. But what I mean by Archimedes Factor is that Syracuse in olden-timey Sicily had this reputation for being a formidable foe in war because they built the cleverest warships, weapons, and defenses. And almost all these clever inventions were supposedly the genius of one man, a dude named Archimedes. Now, let's take a little side trip into real-life history for a second to highlight just why Archimedes is so damn awesome. So Syracuse is on the island of Sicily, and it's constantly getting threatened by the Romans because they want to take over. But in order to land in Syracuse and take the city, the Roman soldiers first have to come through this harbor or port with high cliffs on either side of the place. So they get their ships, fill them up with legions of soldiers, and try to come through the port. On the top of the cliffs, Archimedes allegedly set up these giant hooks or claws on cranes, which would then go down and grab onto the front of a ship like a fishing rod, and then literally pull just the front of the ship out of the water. Now, this wasn't enough to damage the boat, but it would flip it over and drown all the people on board. In this way, some of the Roman ships were capsized and taken out of the fight before it even began, and without a single citizen of Syracuse dying. The remaining ships continued into the port, but this was a trap. And once they were in position, Archimedes had the soldiers of the city pull massive chains around the harbor to lock the Roman fleet in. Then they shot burning arrows through the windows of the fortress beside the harbor, burning the leftover ships and saving their city from the Roman invaders. For a while, anyway. Also, Archimedes allegedly invented the loophole, a type of window in a fortress wall that is tiny and thin on the outside of the wall and much bigger inside the building. This allows archers to see their targets but stay inside the building while shooting, and because the outside wall is so tiny, it's hard for an enemy to fire back at the archers. The target is just way too small. Now, the point of the Archimedes reference and comparison is to say that the people of Tyrosh were also super clever, and they invented a bunch of unique devices, tools, weapons, and armor. It's basically what they're known for, aside from training gladiators. So just like Archimedes did for Syracuse, but instead of one guy inventing all that great stuff, a whole bunch of people did it together. Also, I wanted to make note of the fact that the Tyroshi people were ruled by a single person, a man who was elected for life from one of the rich and powerful noble families. But only the other noble people got to vote on this issue. Your average everyday butcher, baker, or candlestick maker had no say in the matter. So this guy, who was the ruler, was called the Archon of Ty Roche, and in our story, in the Game of Thrones story, at some point, he actually sends a marriage proposal to Daenerys Targaryen. Obvs, she totally says no. Also, in Tyrosh, they make a very famous pear brandy, so there's that. Moving on to the city of Myr. Located on the mainland of the continent, this quarrelsome daughter sits at the mouth of the Sea of Mirth. Like Tyrosh and Lys, Myr is the type of place where it doesn't really matter if your family was pure-blooded Valyrians or whether you were good at fighting and leading armies into battle. Power came from money, and it still does. Trade is the most important aspect of these societies. Also, these are all super heavy-duty slave states. So Tyrosh, we just talked about, they were all about training slaves that could fight in the slave armies or in gladiator-style matches. But in Myr, the slaves were mostly artisans and craftsmen. These skilled laborers are sought after all over Essos, or more specifically, wherever slavery is practiced. The Myrish people also produce a bunch of important trade goods, or their slaves do anyway. Their tapestries are the best in the world, even better than Norvos and Kohor, and they produce the best lace in the world as well, which is the most delicate and most intricate lace. Then there's a sweet green wine, which is sometimes described as a nectar. I'm guessing it's a fruit-based alcoholic drink that's a little on the thick side, hence why it's called nectar. Finally, they have some of the best glass in the world, and they specialize in making something called Myrish lenses, which are turned into basic telescopes and microscopes. Now let's talk about why I think of Myr as kind of like Naples in Italy in the olden-timey days. So in Italy, Naples is famed for artisans and a flourishing artistic scene that developed in the Renaissance, much like Florence was under the Medici. Or you could say that Naples would have been a lot like the way Myr is portrayed here because of these highly skilled artisans. And just like Myrish wine is well known in the fantasy world, in the real world, wine from this region of southern Italy is really amazing. Speaking as a wine drinker, of course, but don't just take my word for it. The ancient Greeks named southern Italy, specifically the Amalfi Coast, the land of wine, so you know it had to be good. Also, both Myr and Naples are mainland port cities. Unlike Tyrosh, which was a brand new city, Myr used to be the home of a group of Andals who had already built a city there with high stone walls. Some Valyrians came down and either killed or enslaved all the Andals that lived there and took over the spot to make their own city. It's interesting to note that the population of Myr actually look quite different than the people who live in other Valyrian outpost cities. Instead of being a mix of Valyrians and Andals, they have light brown skin and dark hair like Dornish people do. That is the reason why some maesters think that the Myrish people are descendants of a mix of Rhoynars, Andals, and Valyrians. It seems like in other cities, the Valyrians mixed only with Andals, except for Bravos, and they were therefore white people. But the people of Myr are only half white. They're also part brown skin too, potentially because they're part Rhoynar. The third and final of the Quarrelsome daughters is the city of Lys. Of all the free cities, Lys is said to be the most beautiful. In fact, it's nicknamed Lys the Lovely. Like Tyrosh, it was founded by Valyrians who didn't have to displace some other people already living there in order to build their resort city. The city itself is one of the southernmost of all the free cities, occupying a series of islands, the largest of which is home to the proper city. The climate is described as being picture perfect: hot sun, warm waters, and cool breezes. The islands are surrounded by a tranquil turquoise ocean, teeming with fish and covered in every kind of fruit tree and flower. The sweet-smelling flowers are partly why the city is also called the Perfumed Sister. Unlike other Valyrian outposts that were meant to be military checkpoints or trade centers, from the very beginning, the purpose of Lys was to be a pleasure garden for the rich and powerful of the Valyrian freehold. The dragon lords would come here for vacations, and as such, they kept the place up to date on all the latest in opulence and luxury. To accommodate the discerning tastes of these dragon lords, Lys was kept stocked with the best alcohol, the finest gourmet foods, opulent fashions, and the hottest musicians, dancers, acrobats, magicians, and even the sexiest, most talented hookers in the world. Lys was like the Las Vegas of Planetos. Or, to be more historically accurate, it was more like Capri in the time of the Romans. Alright, slackers, it's history time. So, during the days of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, the island of Capri was turned into his private Sin City. He built a truly gigantic, very opulent, maybe a little bit grandiose, palace called the Villa Jovis, where it was rumored that he engaged in all manner of sexual depravity, like bisexual orgies, role-playing involving slaves dressed up as mythical creatures like satyrs, BDSM, and on a darker note, this place was notorious for all the pedophilia and bestiality they allegedly had going on, which is totally gross. Now, modern scholars believe that most of these stories are absolute exaggerations because people didn't really like Emperor Tiberius much. But you get the point. The island of Capri was the best spot in olden-timey days for doing the nasty, no matter what kind of nasty that might be. Now, as messed up as that sounds, the same thing could be said about the city of Lys. Famous for the brothels and, most importantly, the prostitutes, Lys to this day remains a feast for all the senses. I should actually clarify here and say that the prostitutes aren't really prostitutes, because that would imply that they got paid. These men and women, and yes, you can totally get male hookers in Lys. Anyway, these people are slaves. And just like the other Quarrelsome daughters, Lys remains a well-known hub for the slave trade. So, if Tyrosh is known for training slaves to be soldiers and gladiators, and Myr is known for training slaves that are excellent craftsmen and artisans, then Lys is known for training slaves who are excellent at having sex. That, and the Lysini people trained slaves for entertainment of all sorts, from musicians to dancers, acrobats, jugglers, you name it. So if you're into slavery and you want some entertainment, or even more, shall we say, adult entertainment, then you would go to buy your slaves in Lys. Unlike the Tyroshi, who did a lot of capturing free people and turning them into slaves, Lys didn't really do that. I mean, they did also capture people to make them into slaves, obviously, but most of their slaves were actually born in Lys and bred by the masters. What I mean by that is that the slave owners would try to breed their slaves the way we breed types of dogs. We create dogs that are either cuddlier or dogs that are good at herding animals or dogs built for specific purposes, right? And the Lysini breed slaves based on how pretty the babies would be. Then they train these babies from an early age, and I'm talking disgustingly, pervertedly, abusively early age, to be some of the most sought-after sex slaves in the world. Aside from slavery, there's another less than savory side to the Lysini culture. The city is famous for poisons that its alchemists create. For example, the Tears of Lys is a poison that was used to kill Jon Arryn, and the Strangler another Lysini invention, was used to kill Joffrey Baratheon. Oberyn Martell spends a great deal of time in Lys apparently learning about poisons, hence why he has the name the Red Viper, because he likes to use poisons that he allegedly learned to make in Lys. Both Lys and Myr are ruled by councils of magisters. Those are the richest and most powerful people in the city, but there isn't a ceremonial or figurehead royal person, which is somewhat different to the political structures of the other free cities. Braavos is ruled by a Sea Lord of Braavos. Lorath is ruled by the three princes, the Fisher Prince, the Harvest Prince, and the Prince of the Streets. Qohor and Norvos are theocracies and therefore ruled by the priests. Pentos is ruled by the Prince of Pentos. Tyrosh is ruled by the Archon of Tyrosh, and Volantis is ruled by the three Triarchs. Although almost all of these cities also have councils of magisters that actually do all the dirty work of everyday governing. Speaking of Volantis,